Inyasha Musandu, I hope I got that right, who will also be talking to us about effective research communications for 25 minutes. From there, we'll move on straight to Mr. Adejuwon's presentation, who will be talking to us about effective use of the print and electronic media for research dissemination. He will also talk to us for like 25 minutes. After this, we'll go on to Q&A, whereby participants will ask questions. Please feel free to direct your questions to any of the speakers, and they will be glad to take the questions. That will be for like 20 minutes. Then after which we will round up by giving a closing remark, which will be done by me. But before we move on, I would like to read the citation of our speakers. I'm going to start with Ms. Inyasha Musandu, who is a strategic communication and knowledge management specialist. She delivers tailor-made, fit-for-purpose capacity building solutions for development practitioners dealing with complex communications challenges. She has experience in leading and supporting communication and policy engagement interventions for researchers, knowledge intermediaries, and development practitioners. Her interests lie in using communication as a transformative tool for improving development outcomes. So that's about Ms. Inyasha Musandu. I'm going to go on to Mr. Adejuwon Soyinka. Mr. Adejuwon Soyinka is a regional editor for West Africa at Conversation Africa. It's an independent source of news and views for academic and research community, delivered directly to the public. He's a two-time International Emmy Awards nominee in investigative journalism. Mr. Soyinka is a multiple award-winning journalist, a pioneer editor, and head of BBC News Pidgin service. He's also a former senior special assistant on media to the Osun State Governor. He's also a deputy general editor, TEL magazine, and also editor for the online publication of TEL. So that's about our speakers for today. So moving on, I'm going to be calling on Mr. Daniel Fossey to please give us a remark from GDN. Mr. Daniel, please.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning for those who are located away from Africa. Yeah, my name is Daniel Fossey, and I'm representing the Global Development Network, where I work as a research fellow in knowledge systems. And for those who are not familiar with the Global Development Network, we are an international organization headquartered in New Delhi, India, and we work globally to support social science research on development issues, to inform public debate and decisions through rigorous and original analysis conducted and communicated locally by social scientists that are connected globally as well. GDN was born a couple of decades ago with a very ambitious mission to promote social science research capacity everywhere on development, for development, and also as development. Our friendship, or rather partnership, with the National Center for Technology Management, in brackets NACETEM, might have been started before, but it has been formally strengthened by the GDN's innovative and a flagship program called Doing Research, which is an NACETEM research team has been implementing it in Nigeria from 2018 to the present. The DRR program aims to assess systematically how the features of national research system impact the capacity to produce, diffuse, and use quality social science research to the benefit of social and economic development. It does it so through its standard methodology called Doing Research Assessment. And we have currently implemented the DRR program in 15 countries. The latest entry is El Salvador, and in the past 20 months, we worked in Bolivia, Myanmar, Indonesia, Venezuela, and Nigeria. There are three things I would like to mention about the Doing Research Assessment as a standard methodology for DRR program. The first one is the Doing Research Assessments focus on the national research system. This is because we believe that the range of opportunities and the challenges social science face, whether in terms of quality, equity, or access to resources or influence of decision makers, are defined by what happens within national boundaries. This is in spite of the critical importance of regional or global connections. The second thing, we define a research system as the interplay of three functions: production, diffusion, and uptake. In other words, we are not much interested in publications counts, but in whether the research system has the capacity to produce rigorous knowledge and how this knowledge travels, as well as who access this knowledge. And finally, we see the doing research assessment, what NASATEM will briefly present today from their DRI report, as a starting point for stimulating discussions on research policy in which independent and local research institutions have a voice. Hence, our choice is to have local principal investigators and to connect them across countries in a network where teams learn from each other and feed their comparative knowledge into their national debates. With this note, we thank NASATEM for inviting GDN to participate in this webinar series, and we also extend our sincere gratitude to the team. And these webinars that NASATEM have planned are a great example of how to use the kind of knowledge the DRI produces to advance research capacity. And with today's webinar on effective research communication and the use of research dissemination media is also of great relevance because normally research is being produced for two major reasons: advancing frontiers of knowledge or theoretical contribution, but also facilitating the solving of issues or problems besetting communities, or practical contribution or development, playing a developmental role. Most researchers design their dissemination strategies and dedicate their dissemination efforts towards academic audiences, despite the fact that they might have initially planned for the non-academic audiences, but they are being let down by the inappropriate use of the dissemination media. So understanding effective use of the print and electronic media for research dissemination is imperative to researchers, authors, and the users of research, including policymakers and practitioners. We are confident that we will learn a great deal on this topic from the wealth of expertise of our workshop facilitators. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daniel Fossey. Thanks a lot for that opening remark. So I'm just going to go on to our first speaker today, which will be Mr. Olofin. He's going to be telling us some of the results that we got from the project conducted in collaboration with GDN. Mr. Olofin, please.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. I'm sharing my screen. I believe you can see it.
Yes, we can.
And you can also hear me very well.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, so good afternoon from Nigeria, everyone. And thank you very much for joining us today. So our webinar continues today. As we all know, it's a series. We had the first one last week, and it was on production of social science research. Today, we are moving on to the second, which is on dissemination of social science research results in Nigeria. So this is the team of us that did this study. I'm the gentleman there in the top middle, and the rest are big men and women that we work together on this project. A little bit about the sample we use for this study, in case somebody is joining us for the first time today, because we already talked about this last week. So the study focused on 4 major categories of factors: the higher education institutions, the private sector, the civil society organizations, and then government and funding agencies, which we further divided into 3: MDAs and donors, research institutes, and policymakers in the houses of assembly. Our study had a major activity which we called stakeholder mapping, where we mapped all the actors and stakeholders who do research or who do one thing or the other with social science research within our system. And we found almost 2,000 of them drawn from across the different categories of actors, out of which we selected a sample of a total of 130 institutions. In the end, we were able to use questionnaires from 805 individuals as researchers, research administrators, and policymakers. Last week, like I said, we focused on production, where we looked at the people who do social science research in Nigeria and their productions in terms of publications. We looked at the funding to support social science research in Nigeria, and as well as support system in terms of infrastructure and power, and then other support services that drive research system within our system. Today, we are looking at, after the research is done, how is it disseminated? How is it diffused so that all the necessary stakeholders who should go on to use the result of the research, they get to know about it and they get to know enough about the research and the result for them to influence policy and research. In our next webinar, which is next week, we're going to be concentrating on uptake of research for policy and practice. And in the last webinar, we'll be looking at some cross-cutting issues like gender. So today we are talking about dissemination. When we say dissemination of research, we also mean diffusion of research. It's the same as research communication. And like this figure portrays, research is not an end in itself. Research is in a continuum of what we call research to policy nexus. In fact, we can even say research to policy to development.
Hello, Mr. Lopian. Hello?
Indices of the society so that people get to know about it and then they can use the research. So here we are saying that dissemination of research results is key. In fact, it is critical in that research to policy nexus, because if people don't get to know about the research you have done in the universities, in the research institute, or wherever we have done our research, then it just dies with us. And then the real value of research, which is to use it to better the lives of people through policy and practice, then that doesn't get to happen. So dissemination is key in that process of research leading to development. In the study, we looked at a number of things in diffusion of research. First, we look at the diversity of research actors. We are saying that we wanted to know whether those who do research are actually diverse within the system or whether they are concentrated in a single place. We use the Affindal index, which measures the concentration of actors within a system. And in the case of Nigeria, the figure we got is 0.016, which is actually good because that means that actors are well dispersed. They are rather really deconcentrated. And if you can see from the map of Nigeria that is presented here, the map is showing different administrative units, which in our system we call states. So we have about 36 states, apart from the FCT, the Federal Capital Territory. So in all, we have about 37 different administrative units. And what we have done here is to characterize the number of universities in each state. And the different categories is highlighted by the different shades of color. From the light blue to the deepest green. So the light blue color is showing states that have at least 2 universities in the state. And the darkest green down there is showing states that have around 14 universities. We know that the concentration of universities differ across board, but we are saying that in general, as a whole, Nigeria has universities dispersed all over in every state. And that is really, really good for us because then it means that research is well dispersed, everybody gets to contribute to the entire system. And then we went on to ask, okay, if actors are dispersed, do they work together? do they collaborate? And then we found that actually within our system, collaboration is commonplace. Researchers get to work together across disciplines, across institutions, even both locally and internationally in the production of research results. Then we looked at how is research communicated? How do researchers get other stakeholders to know what they have done and how it can influence the way they live and what they do? And first, we found that an average social science researcher is not very well skilled in research communications, especially with stakeholders outside the academia. So research communication seems to just be within the researchers themselves, telling themselves what they have done, communicating what they have done, and it doesn't really get out much out of the academia because the researchers themselves don't really have that a good enough skill to communicate their research results. We looked at major means of dissemination and we found that researchers in our system use journals, conferences, debates, and news media to diffuse or disseminate their research results. We also found that sometimes the policymakers, the national legislatures and state legislatures, they have regular public hearings, and sometimes they invite researchers to come and make presentations about their research result or contribute to a particular debate they are having or make input to something they are thinking to do. But we also found that this doesn't happen much of the times, and the inputs of researchers don't get picked up many a times, even when they appear in these public hearings. We also find that some researchers do private consultancies. They consult for the industry, they consult for private firms, they consult for think tanks, but not much of the time. Most of the communication is within the academia. We also looked at online visibility of research, and we found that in our system, online visibility of research is rather poor, both for local journals and even for researchers themselves. We find that most of our local journals in Nigeria are not visible online at all. Most journals don't even have online repositories. It's just print the documents and just distribute locally like that. And even many researchers do not have institutional web pages where their research is publicized. Some don't even have personal web pages. Some are not even registered in any international repositories like ResearchGate and the rest of them. So online visibility of research is poor. Last week, we compared the amount of social science production in Nigeria with that of South Africa, and we could see that the gap was very wide. But in the real sense, actually, Nigerian social science researchers produce a lot of research results, but most of these thousands and tens and even hundreds of thousands of research production doesn't get seen online. We also looked at the use of the print media and radio channels for communicating research results, and we found that only about 13% of Nigerian social science research use the print media to communicate their research results with other stakeholders. About 22% use the radio channels, perhaps because the radio channels are cheaper to use than the print media. I believe our speakers will speak more about that in the presentations today. And then finally, we looked at how accessible research results are to different categories of people. And this is very important because as researchers, we need to know that our research is needed, or should I say, should reach different categories of people, not even only policymakers. We tend to emphasize on the policymakers most of the time, but it's not only policies that change society. Sometimes people groups play a lot of role in defining and choosing, deciding, and do I say activating what eventually will work. So we have the private sector is a category of people that need to know about the research results, individual committee members, policymakers, yes, then community groups and associations, minority groups, people like women, people like maybe youth, they need to know what happens within the academia. They need to know the results that are coming out. And then, of course, researchers within the academics. And we found that research results are mostly and readily and usually and regularly available and accessible to researchers and academics far more than these other groups of people that are also quite important. So pretty much about dissemination of research results, that these were the things that our study and our results are focused on. I believe we'll hear more from our speakers today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Olofiyan, for that insightful, presentation into what we found conducting this particular research. One thing that came to me was that most of our researchers are not skilled in presenting their findings to the stakeholders, and this will key directly into what Ms. Nyasha Musandu is going to be telling us today. So I'm going to call on Ms. Nyasha Musandu to please give us a presentation. She's going to be speaking on effective research communication. Please, Ms. Nyasha, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to speak to everybody. So warm greetings from Zimbabwe, where we're going to talk a little bit about effective research communication. Now, I think the real key here is figuring out what we mean by effective research communication. So I'd just like to start by saying that as a communicator myself, I'm not always very comfortable with the idea of speaking to myself. So please, if as I speak, you have questions that come up, please engage with me and drop them in the chat box. It just makes it so much easier for us to have a dynamic conversation and for me to answer you at point of need or where information might be useful. So that would be my one ask. I always find it very awkward when I have to speak to myself. And as the world has become more working from home, I increasingly find it's harder to get those connections and conversations. So this is an invitation for us to engage around this topic. So I think the presentation before was really useful in outlining a little bit of what we mean by research communication and what the difference is between research communication and what we usually call dissemination. So, there was a lot of emphasis and I think a lot of evidence that came out that we are doing the research is definitely getting done. But the issue is that this research is not always necessarily reaching the multiple audiences that we want it to reach. So how do we move from just communicating to effectively communicating? And what do we mean by effective research communication? So, I hope you can see my full screen. If there are any issues, please just do let me know in the chat box.
Yeah, we can see.
Great, thank you. So where do we fit as Nigeria in this context, and why is it important for us to really be looking at research communication? So what do the numbers tell us? The numbers from the Social Science Review between 2015 and 2017 tell us a really interesting thing. We have 2,000 organizations, 170 universities, 75 government and funding agencies, 65 private sector organizations, 115 NGOs, 4,085 peer-reviewed publications, and 34% of this is open access. So the numbers tell us that there's a lot of information being generated. There's a lot of production happening. And this knowledge, when we talk about social sciences, should be embedded in people, right? So the idea is that we take this knowledge and we use it to better design programs, to better design policies, to better implement, to ensure that what we are doing for the good of people actually is reaching the people it's supposed to reach and making the changes that are supposed to happen. Now, unfortunately, in a landscape like this, and Nigeria is no exception, we'll see this across the board in any place that anyone is trying to influence or embed evidence, that there is a lot of noise, right? So how do we make this movement from production to diffusion to what we really call uptake? And so if we look, what we really have is an information overload. And I want you to think of yourself in this moment as an individual, not so much as a researcher. Let's take off our academic hats if we have them, but think of ourselves more as consumers of information. And what is the one thing that you can definitely say for sure is that we are inundated with the amount of information. As technology has improved and as technology has really diversified and as access and reach has diversified, so has the amount of noise. And so there's a lot of noise in the system, and the system is very complex. What can researchers or knowledge producers do to ensure that this noise is going to be distilled, right? What can they do to ensure that the messages reach the right people? So I've got a short time to have this discussion with you. Like I said, I'd love to hear your questions. I'm going to quickly unpack a few steps of what I think we could do and what some of the tricks and tips are to ensure that information doesn't get lost in this cacophony of too much information. What are some of the strategic things we can do to ensure that our research communication is at the core effective? And my favorite word for now would be strategic, right? So reaching the places it needs to reach in the ways it needs to get. So how do we ensure that it reaches those non-academic actors? Okay. Right. So before we go into the how, I think let's take a little bit of a look at the analytical framework. And this was developed by ODI's RAPID team a few years ago, but I think that the lessons drawn from there are still quite useful and important for our purposes. And we want to really look at what the environment in which evidence is trying to influence, whether it be policy, whether it be behavior, whether it be certain groups of individuals. What does that environment actually look like? Because as we understand the environment, we're better equipped to navigate it. So in the world that exists, we have the evidence, right? Which is where we are involved. We produce evidence, but we're not the only producers of evidence. There's lots of evidence produced. There's lots of things that are at the forefront. So we have to look at what that world of evidence looks like and be able to locate our evidence in that framework. Then we also have to look at the links between policy and research communities. So what is the power dynamics there? What are some of the competing discourses? Where is their trust? So if we look at our own environments, we know that there are people who, when they speak, there's much more trust attributed to them, and others not so much. So who are the movers and shakers within this environment, and what are the links that exist? Then we also have to ask ourselves if we're going to be really successful at engaging and influencing, that what does our political context look like? Now, I know none of us here are politicians. That's not our role. We want to generate evidence. We want to ensure that the evidence reaches the right places. But the reality is our external environment is one in which politics plays a really big role. So we need to understand what some of the political and economic structures and processes are. What is the culture? What are some of the institutional pressures? What exactly would implementing some of the changes we would like to see or that our evidence is suggesting mean? What would the competing priorities be? So we want to start. A good way to begin to understand where our evidence fits in is a little bit of mapping around some of these key influences and understanding the complexity of this environment. And once we have looked at that, we really want to look at What is the power, politics, and evidence use? So this is where the doing research work really fits in. What does that power, politics, and evidence look like? Who are some of those knowledge intermediaries, and where is evidence production and communication happening? And in that kind of red area where these three considerations fit in, we're more likely to be effective if we can combine what we know about power and politics, we can combine what we know about evidence use, and we can combine what we know about those actors who may help us to move our evidence in a way that makes it useful to people, or to move information in a way that makes it accessible to individuals. Okay, so how do we go about doing this? So the first thing I would say, and you know, I don't know if any of you, when you're thinking about evidence, have thought about change in this way, or when you're thinking about your research and what you're producing it for. If you've ever asked yourself the question, what type of change am I advocating for? So what are the types of change that I would like to see reflected in my environment? So right here, I've outlined the different types of change we can talk about, right? And as a producer of evidence, you need to think about, when you're looking especially at the policy space or any type of change, what is the change you're advocating for? Can you actually articulate what that change is? Where do you see this evidence being used? When we look at the diffusion, where are the areas that you would like to see this diffusion taking place? And so there are different types of change. We can look at what we call discursive change. So this is change that happens at the level of how we talk about certain issues, how we frame things. We might want to see that we want people to change how they talk about a particular issue. So maybe we want to see how we talk about access to water, or maybe we want to see a change in how we actually talk about pro-poor policies. Are they reaching the right people? So there's a discursive change we want to happen. There's another level of change, and think about it more as levels, because sometimes there are various ways in which change can happen. But if you think about it as levels, it might also help you to think about where you are in terms of the change process and how you can deepen that change. We can look at the second here, that is procedural change. So this is really about, there's a policy in place, or there's a way things are done, and we want to change how they're done. We want to change maybe just a small point. So maybe what our evidence is showing us is that actually this policy could work if we change just one aspect of its implementation. There's somewhere where it's falling short. So we want to move the conversation. We want to influence where implementation is happening, at an implementation point. The other type of change we may be trying to influence is what we may call content change. And that's really where we're looking at, you know, the real nuts and bolts of a particular policy. We want to really look at a policy and figure out how evidence can fit into it. We want to look at the body of work, how things are done, and really influence how that content is envisioned or is thought about. The other type of change, which moves us to a higher level, which is a bit trickier to look at, is that attitudinal change. So yes, people may talk about things differently. We may have policies in place, but people are not changing how they do things, right? So that attitude, how do we change how people are thinking and framing their minds around certain issues? Because sometimes it's in changing our attitudes to things that we can actually see change take root. So what are we advocating for? A change in attitude. And then the real hard one, the one that takes a long time, but the real kind of gold standard of change is that behavioral change, right? So changing how an ecosystem works, or changing how a community behaves. And so as generators of evidence, we need to look at ourselves and the research question we're asking, or the research we're generating, as individuals, as institutions, as bodies or groups of people with similar goals, and say, where is it that we want to influence change? At what point are we looking to influence change? And what does that mean for how we approach, how we frame and talk about the change we want to see? So one of the places we can start is really just by mapping and understanding the system that we exist in. So we want to map the political context, and people who are really successful at research communication and influencing research uptake processes really understand the political context that they exist in, right? So when we're moving from that research to communication uptake, we're really trying to understand. So, you know, one of the things that I enjoy a lot when I get to do this training with people face to face is to ask the question that on the research you have, if you're trying to influence a specific policy or a change process, what is the existing, you know, in a nutshell, what does the existing policy environment look like? And if you were to lobby somebody, what would you say about where your research fits in order to generate that conversation that allows people to start to think about change? And I know it sounds obvious, but it's something we sometimes forget to do, which is really to understand what is my political context and how do I map it so that I can successfully insert knowledge in a way that people can understand and in a way that's relevant and timely to the issues of the day, so that my evidence has much more likely to influence change. Then we need to understand the role and behavior of actors, right? So who is in this sphere, right? So if we're talking to only other academics, who are we missing in the sphere? We might need to talk to organizations that also consume knowledge and maybe are lobbyists or people who use our evidence in a different way to advocate for change, right? Those are some of the actors that may exist. And we might want to look at actors such as the media. What role does the media play? And I won't spend much time on that. I know we've got an exciting session coming up now on what role the media can play in really taking evidence and framing it, and how that might be useful. We can look at political actors, we can look at donors, we can look at institutions, and we need to understand what some of those relationships and values are, where exactly are the intersections, and who do I need to bring on board, or who do I need to give evidence, and in what form do I give them this evidence to make it useful to them, easily understood, and more likely to be used. Research also needs to be complemented with other forms of knowledge. So as we saw earlier, there's lots of things competing to change the environment. So what can we bring to bear to complement what our research is showing us? What other evidence can we bring? Can we bring community voice, community stories? What can we bring to really make sure that our evidence is not only accurate, which I'm very sure it is because you've gone through the rigorous process of developing it, but actually is compelling? How do we take that evidence and ensure that it is presented in a way that's compelling, is presented in a way that it brings together other bodies of evidence that suggest that if we take these parts, or if we look at an issue in a particular way, we're more likely to see social impact or positive social change? And then we need to think about what is our strategy of action. So there's so many things available to us, right? When we're looking at communication, it's not just the dissemination of papers, it's the soft things, the meetings, ensuring that people hear information, the one-on-one conversations, social media, using the media, radio engagement. So what exactly are we planning to do with the information we have? And given the people we've been thinking about, where are we more likely to be able to put this information in a way that's useful? So the first step we'd really take is a little bit of stakeholder analysis, right? Looking and saying, okay, so with my research, with the evidence I have, what is the change I'm trying to achieve, right? And who are the key actors? And we do a little bit of stakeholder analysis, and I'll show you a little bit of a brief framework of one way you can look at stakeholder analysis. But you look at that environment and you say, okay, so don't just say, I want to target policymakers, or I want to target other academics, or I want to target people who are interested in this issue. Who are these policymakers, right? They sit at different stages of influence, they sit at different levels of government, they sit in different institutions. Really spell out who these people are and what it is you hope they'll be able to help you to do. Who are these actors? If we're talking about a water issue, maybe we're talking about advocates, or maybe we're talking about women's groups, right? Because water may be a very a women's issue as well. Maybe the evidence shows us that the issues of water affect women more than they do other groups. We want to really spell out who these people are. And then we want to take a process of mapping them. Now, what I have here is the power interest matrix, but that's just one way of thinking about stakeholders. There are many other ways to envision them, but what you want to do is to take those actors and say, okay, so this women's organization or this group of actors, this group of people, what are the things that they advocate for? What are the things that they do? Do they align with what I do? Do they align with the evidence? Would this help them in any way, or where do they sit? Are they opposed to an issue? Especially when we're looking at policy change, right? Are these people opposed to this issue? What would I need to do to move these players around my quadrant? So here what we have is the power interest matrix. And here we're looking more at the relationship between power and interest. And what we want to do is to place our stakeholders in the different quadrants and decide if they've got low interest and low power. Is that a stakeholder we should be engaging too much effort in? Probably not. But if they've got high interest, right, or maybe they've got medium interest and high power, what do we need to do to take that player who sits in the middle of our quadrant and move them to a place where they're using their power to support what the evidence is showing? And I know every time I talk to researchers, this is where it gets a bit tricky, because you're not advocates. Absolutely, that's not your job. You're not advocacy people. But at the heart of that is understanding how we frame things and how we can put information to different actors can help to really influence change. So not necessarily you being the activists of change, but really being aware of how this evidence can feed into those who might take that role, knowledge intermediaries, those who translate evidence, to allow us to get to a process where our research is actually doing what it should be doing, which is informing how the world is shaped. So I haven't seen any questions. I'm just going to wrap up quickly. When we're looking at our audiences, right, the one thing I want to emphasize is one size does not fit all, right? So we can't look at our research and just think this is the message, this is everything that people need to know about what I've researched. You really have to think, okay, so if I'm looking at that women's group, or if I'm looking at that particular ministry portfolio, if I'm looking at district level, what are the questions people are going to be asking at that level? At that audience level, what are the questions they're asking, and what information is going to be most useful to them? So I know when we produce research, you know, there's a propensity to want to talk about all the research we've produced, all the interesting results that we have unpacked, but not all the evidence is important all the time for everyone. Right? There are pieces of evidence that will be more important or better understood by other audiences then. So how are we framing it? How are we taking this evidence and ensuring that that it influences and is shaped in a way that can influence change? So I've seen a question in the chat box. I'll go back to the power interest matrix, Isaac, in just a few seconds. I'll wrap up and then just go back there. So we're looking at those audiences. Then we want to think a little bit about targeting our messages, right? So really messages, because one size doesn't fit all, we have to think about what it is we want to communicate. And so we usually have to ask ourselves a series of questions. What is the objective of our message? So we go back to that question, what is it we're trying to achieve? And why is it important? So not only why is it important to me, the individual who produced it, but much more importantly, why is it important to the people I want to do something about it? What are the questions they have that are keeping them up at night? And how will this evidence plug in a way that allows them to answer some of these questions, right? So why is it important to them, to that audience, right? who are these target audiences, right? So who is it that we're talking to? What do you want them to do? Now, this is really important, especially when we're looking at uptake, right? We have a piece of evidence, we communicate it well, but actually we're not helping, especially when we're looking at policymakers, we're not helping them do anything. We may just be highlighting a problem they already know about, right? So they know this problem exists. And so in some ways, we're just highlighting what they know. People who do well and where evidence and that body of evidence becomes really important, and collaborating where other evidence exists, is that we want to bring this body of evidence to bear to help policymakers make decisions about what they should do. We want to give them options, right? And sometimes our research is telling us, maybe at an implementation level, that these are some of the things we could do to achieve that pro-poor policy, right? So we want to look at it in that way.
Sorry to interject you, Ms. Musandu. So you have less than 3 minutes. Sorry.
Thank you. Don't worry, almost done. This is the last one, yeah. And then how exactly should the people go about doing it, right? So what is it that you want them to do differently? And so at the heart of that is we have to look at dynamic communication strategies. So using not only our academic publications, but translating that research so that it's useful for social media. We're talking about it, we're engaging, radio programming, brochures where we can, booklets. We have to look at a dynamic communication strategy that allows us to speak to different people. And then we also have to monitor, like look at our communication and say, has it been doing what we need it to do? And if not, how do we change what we're doing so that we get closer to that evidence influencing in a way we hope it influences? Yeah, and so that's kind of the end of it. I'll go back to the power interest if I can just for a minute, just to say, what that really means is just a way of mapping your stakeholders and the power and influence they may have, right? So we're just trying to look at if a player has high power, right? They're like up in this quadrant, but they have a low interest. These are people with power, but no interest, but maybe they're really important for us to be able to achieve something. So how do we move them over into what we've called players, right? The people who have power and have interest. Who would we need to use? What information do we need to give them? How do we change their minds? So it's a bit of an interesting process that you would spend a day or so doing and really unpacking who these different actors might be. Sorry, I'm just reading the question.
Okay.
So the question here is, evidence-based policymaking reform obviously needs smooth chain between policymakers and researchers. Public-private partnership specific to evidence generation is challenging in Africa. So what best approach has been seen or proposed? So I think that, yes, there should be there's no such thing as a smooth chain between policymakers and researchers. We have different objectives, right? We have different needs and we're doing things for different reasons. So I would say that's why it's important to kind of understand your context and who the other actors are, so that you may have those intermediaries who bridge that gap for you, who may stand in the place where there might be a very tense relationship between producers of evidence and policymakers. How do we then get to a place where we can facilitate knowledge movement? So it happens through various partnerships, but it happens by being quite intentional about who we're targeting and what we hope they can help us to do, and also understanding priorities of those we wish to influence. So sometimes we generate evidence that just isn't at that time useful to anybody, right? So maybe we can put that away, but opportunities do come where it becomes interesting again, or maybe catches the public imagination. How then do we reinsert that evidence into that sphere? So I know my time is up, sorry.
Okay. So maybe, are you trying to take another one, Ms. Musandu?
Should I go ahead or?
You know what, let me just quickly call on the next speaker, then maybe after that we can do Q&A, please.
Okay, great. So I'll answer after.
All right. So thank you very much, Ms. Musandu, for that insightful, presentation. We really, appreciate your insight in trying to tell us how do we communicate our research effectively. One thing that actually struck me within the presentation is that when you are trying to disseminate research, it actually starts, at the beginning of the project. But what you see many researchers doing is that they do this once the research is completed. What you make us to understand here is that when you are trying to disseminate research, you should actually start at the beginning of that project, whereby you map the stakeholders and know exactly what power do they hold for them to be able to, get the meaning from that particular research. So thank you very much. I'm going to be calling on Mr. Adejuwon Soyinka now, who is going to be telling us something about effective use of print and electronic media for research dissemination. Mr. Soyinka, please, the floor is yours. You can please share your screen. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I do hope you can see my screen now.
Yes, we can. Yes.
Good afternoon from Lagos, Nigeria. Good day to everyone in different parts of the world where we may be and different time zones. So my job is made a lot easier this afternoon because of the previous speaker, Nyasha, they kind of laid the foundation for the conversation we should be having in the course of this interaction. And I call it an interaction actually because I expect it to be interactive. I expect us to ask questions whenever we feel like, use the chat box. Feel free to interject if you want to contribute at any point in time. I guess and I believe that actually, if we're able to do it that way, then we might be able to take a lot more out of this session than just sticking to the slides alone. And there's so much more we can say in practical terms than the slides can afford us to talk about. But from the topic itself, you'll find that I'm expected to talk in more practical terms in terms of how to effectively use print and electronic media for research and dissemination. So there's no doubt that you do research. I mean, that foundation has already been laid by previous speakers. There's no doubt that this research are useful and that they are impactful. There's no doubt that the society needs them. What we have seen, what I have seen, and what I've also showed here is that there's often a disconnect between the researchers and their research, and then the society that is supposed to benefit from the body of knowledge that the researchers have. And that's why my conversation this afternoon, or our discussion this afternoon, will be tied a lot around even the very concept of the conversation Africa, which is where I work. Because in fact, at the very core of the essence of the conversation as a media platform is what we are discussing today. This is why the conversation exists. Being able to effectively, communicate research outcomes, to the end users. And when you were reading my profile, you mentioned what the conversation is: an independent source of news, analysis, and views from the academic community, academic and research community, direct to the end users. And I'm going to explain that as we move along. So, but first, we may want to look at, okay, so what do we mean when we talk about the media? I'm sure we all know what the media is. At this session, we all know what the media is. We all have interacted with one form of media or the other. In fact, this conversation is happening, this session is happening or has been enabled by the media itself, one form of media platform. I mean, Zoom that we're using, it's a media platform that we're using this afternoon. And that's why we're able to talk to ourselves from different time zones and different jurisdictions, and we're all able to be here. But the media goes beyond just that. It's broad. So you're talking about news, you're talking about music, you're talking about movies, you're talking about promotional messages, you're talking about data. All of this, refer to the different component parts of the media, including what we refer to as the print and electronic media, or as we move along, we'll then be talking about digital media. But print media, electronic media. What do we mean by print and electronic media? Again, as academics or researchers, you obviously are competent with both of them. So many of us do research that ends up in printed journals. So that's some form of print media, and it communicates our research outcomes. Of course, they are peer reviewed, and then they are distributed within our own channels. That we consider to be very, very effective and very, very useful for our purposes as researchers. But what has happened, and we will discuss that as we move along, is that if we do that, and we've already stated it at the beginning as well, whatever it is that we have found is limited, or the knowledge of it, or the awareness of it is limited to the people within our sphere of influence, fellow experts, academics, and people who might come across that journal in that printed format. But of course, print media goes beyond that. It also refers to normal average newspaper, print magazines, and all books as well, and all sorts of other printed formats of messages. Then electronic media, of course, refers to how messages are shared on electronic devices for the audiences, and that refers to your normal TV, radio platforms, and what have you. Then nowadays, when you talk about digital media, you're referring to a point of convergence, where a platform where computing meets communication, and both of them need to work on your content. So you are bringing computing and communication skills to bear on your content, and to bear on how you are able to push your content out there, and be able to effectively target your audiences. What kind of segment of the society do you want to talk to with this communication? How do you determine where and how to reach them? Where do they exist? Where are they commonly found? Are they easily or commonly found on Facebook? Are they found on Twitter? Are they easily found on other electronic platforms? So digital media allows us to have that kind of convergence between the print, the traditional print, electronic media, and then using the latest technology to be able to fashion our communication and be able to reach a lot more people. So, and this has happened, of course, with the advent of social media, with what we refer to as transmedia storytelling, in which case the story starts sometimes from print, and then you can take it onto electronic platforms, and you can take it on to radio or TV. Then you can actually have a social cut of that same story. So nowadays we produce a documentary, say a 1 hour TV documentary, and there's a podcast version of it that sits, on the internet. There's a radio version of it. Then there's a social cut of it, and that same story ends up on Twitter for the specific content that goes on Twitter. The way it is fashioned, the way it is packaged is different, and it is deliberate, because you understand the platform that is Twitter and how the language of that platform and how messages or information is consumed on that platform. So that kind of transmedia storytelling, that kind of movement from one platform to the other, being able to tell one story on multiple platforms at the same time is what we're referring to when we talk about the convergence of digital media. But in all of this, we can sit here and talk about the media, and make sure that is so useful for you, such as how can you then make use of this platform to disseminate or effectively your research, your work. So how is the media used for effective dissemination of research? Like I said earlier, that is the very essence of the conversation as a model that started in Australia in 2011, but then has grown across the world, and now it's a global network, of the conversation. So you have the conversation in Africa, you have Indonesia, you have Australia, New Zealand, you have Spain, you have Canada, UK, France, the US, and other parts of the world. So Now you have the conversation in all these places, and now you have a dedicated global network of journalists dedicated to democratizing knowledge. And what do we mean by that? You can see on your screen the kind of reach that we've had at the Conversation Africa, which started in 2015. You know. Now, and what do we mean by democratizing knowledge? Basically, what we do is ensure that your research, your academic paper, get presented in the language that the audience will understand and will be able to connect with easily. So you've done this beautiful research. It's been peer reviewed. It's been published in an academic journal. It actually holds the solution to a major social issue, or an engineering solution, or a medical health solution, and all of that. But it doesn't travel beyond the circle, the academic circle of colleagues and experts like yourself. What we do is have an editor work with you. So the editor reaches out to the researcher and says, okay, so we've seen this research of yours. It's great. We've gone through it. We've seen the key points of the research. How do we then help you communicate this to a larger audience? So what do? We simply apply what we call the inverted pyramid method of news writing. So what is the most important point of this research outcome? What solution has it brought? What has it found? Then how did you go about making those findings? What method did you use? And what impact would this make on the society? So if you found something that will, for instance, impact, say, in the city of Lagos, for instance, the major challenge is transportation and traffic congestion, and people spend hours in traffic trying to move from point A to point B. So imagine there's a research that seeks to solutions to traffic challenge in Lagos State. Obviously, that will interest the policymakers. That will interest the average person who lives around in Lagos State with all the challenges of moving around and all of that. But how do you communicate it to us in such a way that we can understand what you're saying at a glance? Because the news platform or the news media environment is a place where people are in a hurry. Recent research puts the attention span of audiences online, for instance, less than 10 seconds. So in the first 10 seconds, how do you grab their attention? For a text material, it starts from the headline. So what kind of headline have you given that story? So if you have a piece that says 5 ways Lagos traffic can be solved in 2 months, I'm most likely going to want to click on it and read. If you truly have those things itemized, as opposed to a piece that says something like transmodal solution to Lagos traffic, uses technical terms. I'm going to just move on because it doesn't connect to me. So what we encourage researchers to do is ensure that their articles or their research help them bring out how their research and their publications actually affect the average person. What impact does it make on the lives of maybe end user, or on the life of a policy maker, or on the life on the society in general? That's what we do on a daily basis at the conversation. We help you bring it up and then ensure that you connect to the audience. And from what you can see on the screen right now, you see the average number of people that read each month. It shows that there's a connection. We also take it beyond the website, where we produce podcasts, which we call Pasha. So sometimes all we do is ask you a few questions. So it's an explainer. Just basically break down a concept. And what we always tell ourselves is this: can you break down this concept in such a way that the average 15-year-old will understand what you've done? So you understand you are not speaking to experts when you write for us. You're speaking to the end user. You're speaking to the average person out there who may need your research. You're speaking directly to policymakers. You're speaking directly to industry players who may need your research for one solution or the other. And this is what the website looks like. You know, if you have the time, maybe after this session, you can visit the Conversation Africa online and look at what the website looks like. And it's not just about the website, but it's about the impact. So recently we carried out a survey with the researchers who have written for the Conversation. And 80% of them spoke about the fact that writing for, working with our editors to change their academic write-up into a media mass audience friendly piece, you know, have brought them research collaborations. You know, there are 13% of them that said that it has brought them policy engagement. 15% have got TV interviews as a result of this, but 8% got radio interviews. And of course, you have 15% that got invited to conferences, you know, and sessions of this nature. So basically, what we do is ensure that your output, your research is accessible to a larger audience. It's accessible to a larger number of people than what you have within the academic environment. So, and you can see the impact there. And I'm going to still show you individual slides, and this is the theme of the Conversation Africa in West Africa. But I'm still going to show you the slides of individual examples of researchers that we're talking about. Within the last 1 year, this is the number that we've got from West Africa in terms of number of authors, and that 207 refers to, you know, researchers who have produced one research work for the others who have written for us, 317 articles from 38 institutions, and the number of republishers, 600 republishers. I will explain what republishers mean later on. We've also engaged in training. You know, these sessions like this can be an opportunity to do a training on how to actually communicate your research, how to communicate science, you know, and we do that regularly. These are the trainings we did in the course of last year. But I just want to quickly move on to an example of a piece that we published recently. Why Buhari's government is losing the anti-corruption work. For those who are non-Nigerians, Buhari is the president of Nigeria, President Muhammadu Buhari. Of course, he came into office, you know, riding on a strong promise to root out corruption in Nigeria. He finished his first term. He's halfway into his second term, and it would
Mr. Shoyinka, sorry to interject you. You have less than 5 minutes now.
Wow. it would seem that he's losing the fight against corruption. Now, this is not an opinion piece. This is a product of an academic research. So basically, it deals with issues such as, you've already taken care of issues such as facts, you're taking care of issues such as fake news. So because this is a product of a research, somebody can't come up and say, oh, it's just his opinion. He thinks that the president has lost the fight against corruption. No, it's gone out there, it's done a research, it's peer reviewed, it's published. And this is written for us by a gentleman called Dr. Oludayo Sade. He's of the University of Ibadan. He's a researcher and communication expert at the University of Ibadan. This is his dashboard. So we usually have a dashboard for researchers who write for us. These are the number of people who have read it. It's written for us at 21 articles. It's got 463,824 readers and 146 comments. And it's got several, you know, media interview opportunities, interactions with policymakers as a result of the articles that he has written, the podcasts that he has done, you know, the way he's been able to use the media platform to communicate his research findings in a manner that connects with the end user. So at the end of the day, like somebody said earlier on, you need to define your research from the beginning, how you're going to communicate your research. What exactly do you want to tell? What story do you want to tell? And how do you want to tell it? So that when you are gathering materials, you also gather materials including pictures and multimedia that can be used in future. So you illustrate your communication by the time you want to push your story out there in the media space. And I told you that Sade is from the University of Ibadan. This is the dashboard, the institutional dashboard of the University of Ibadan. This shows you the number of reads from that school, and the number of articles, the number of authors that have written for us from that school, and the number of comments from that institution. Of course, we work with several institutions across the continent. This is the dashboard for at the continental level. And earlier on, I mentioned the publisher. So it is not limited to writing for the conversation. When you write for the conversation, content from the conversation is also picked by republishing partners that we have across the world. And you can see just a display of a few of them on the screen. But some of them local to Nigeria, some of them local to different parts of the continent and beyond. These media outfits also get to pick your content when it's written for us and it's been published. And then they will republish because they had that republishing agreement with us. What that does, what happens to your article at the end of the day is that you've not just spoken to people within your region, you've spoken to a global audience, and you've got more people to be able to access your research. And the reason they are accessing it, more importantly, is not simply because you are published on our platform. It's not also simply because it's been republished by these other global media outfits. It is because the content has been presented in a language, in a manner that can be easily connected to the end user. So you are not speaking above their head. We break down terms, we break down concepts, we break down the language, we ensure that we are communicating to at least a 15-year-old. And if you're able to do that, then you would have communicated to policymakers, politicians, you would have communicated to end users, to industries, and to anyone else who may be interested in your research findings. That's basically what I have come to share with us this afternoon. It's basically to talk about how we can present our research in a way that it will connect with a larger audience beyond just the academic sphere in which we exist. I will appreciate questions and comments if we have any of them. I don't know, I've not been looking at the screen if questions are coming or not, but if I have missed anyone, please call my attention to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shoyinka, for that well presented, talk on effective dissemination of research. I think I learned a lot from this, and I'm sure our participants also, feel the same way. Thank you very much. So now I think we are going to go straight to our Q&A, and I have a couple of questions here, which I will be directing to each of the speaker, and I will start with Mr. Shoyinka. Somebody here is asking, it's saying, knowledge dissemination is becoming publishing and presentation to many stakeholders. How can we design a way to measure or evaluate realistic impacts of certain funded research projects? And how can we make this to be applicable to academic promotions?
Okay. Earlier on, I mentioned, and I can quickly go just to look at that slide where we spoke about impact. Because I think this question is about how can we measure impact.
Yeah, that's true.
Again, I was speaking to perspectives, from the perspective of the conversation Africa and generally. From the perspective of the conversation that you write for, one of the ways you measure impact is that you have a dashboard, like I showed you that for Dr. Sadi. On your dashboard, you will see the number of people who read your article, and it is live. As the numbers increase, you see. You'll see comments from people who have read your articles or are engaged with it on our different platforms. Is it on LinkedIn? Are they listening to it as podcast? Or have they read it on the website? They drop their comments. You can see that there as well. Then we have something we call impact tracker. So if you've got an invite for maybe a TV show or a radio interview, or you've been invited to the legislative arm of government to speak on that research or on your paper, it will be indicated there as well. It's indicated there. So anyone actually who have access can visit that platform and see the impact that your that you made in terms of your research, in terms of communicating your research on our own platform. Another way you can measure is, okay, the number of other publications that picked up your research, because then it shows that there is interest. So we publish, and then say Guardian newspaper in Nigeria, or the BBC, or Time, or Al Jazeera, or any of them, or CNN, as it has happened in several instances anyway, then decide to pick it up and reuse that publication. Of course, the model that we use is that we guide you in editing, we guide you in writing and ensuring that you are communicating with a larger audience, but you get to approve the publication before it is published. So we don't take anything away from your research, we don't take anything away from your findings, we don't interpret your findings in our own way, we interpret it the way you have interpreted it. We just ensure that the language, it is presented in such a way that a larger audience can relate. And then if it is ever going to be republished, the only contract we have with our publishers is that the content is republished as it is, including with the name of the researcher. So you don't take anything out of it, you don't add anything to it. So again, that's another way of measuring impact. Now, to speak generally, if you publish something, or you didn't even publish with us, you publish elsewhere, and you can see that you're getting invites for research collaboration, you're getting invites for policy engagement. Of course, that shows you that there is impact of what you've done, and that there's not just impact of your research in terms of the research sake, but there's also impact of the communication of that research. Because we need to understand that there are two different things. Yes, one thing to do is very, very effective and very powerful research. It is another thing to be able to effectively communicate that research in such a way that it creates impact. I hope I'm able to explain the concept like that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shoyinka. Let me please quickly follow that up with this particular question. How does a researcher, get to approach Conversation Africa to be able to write for them?
Right. So there's a slide to that. And that's what I'm showing you right now. So you can reach out to us online. Just check for the conversation.com/Africa. The Conversation Africa online. You can always reach out to us. And then I will I'm going to share this presentation anyway, so you get our contact there. You can send us a mail. We have a pitching portal on the platform, on the website, where you can pitch your story or pitch your idea, and then it will be assigned to one of my colleagues. We will get across to you and start the process from there.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sure our participants will also benefit from that. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Ms. Musandu now. Ms. Musandu, are you with us? Oh, great. Thank you. So this one, I think this one is for you. Somebody's asking, how long does it take to achieve a change? And he or she illustrated by saying, what if your finding is saying a particular community should relocate, but they choose not to? How do you address that as a researcher?
That's a really unfair question. It's like, how long is a piece of string, right? It really depends. And like I said, change isn't always informed by evidence. One of the things we see is that evidence doesn't matter, especially where issues are emotional, where issues might be cultural, where issues might be political. So it would really depend as to what the drivers for that community to relocate are. And to speak honestly, when we're looking at change in any capacity, and I'll use an example of even COVID-19 and vaccines, etc., we have to look at communication as a multifaceted thing that underlies different sectors. It's not enough to tell people why a vaccine is good. It's not enough to tell people that a vaccine works. We have to bring on other actors, other intermediaries. We have to bring on community leaders and bring them to understand what vaccines mean, what do they do. We have to bring church leaders and bring them to understand. We need to look at the politics and maybe look at how we're legislating to create an environment for change to happen. So unfortunately, I wish I could give you an easy answer, but the answer is that that's why we have to be very strategic in the change we're trying to achieve. The evidence is never enough. As we can see, people are emotional, and where emotions are involved, we don't always make decisions based on evidence. Evidence actually, it shows, becomes a minor player in how people make decisions. So how do we frame evidence in a way that allows a community to engage and have conversations that may lead us to the outcome? So unfortunately, no quick fixes, but really it's about looking at that whole environment and how do we create an enabling environment for evidence to contribute to the change that we want to see.
Thank you very much, Ms. Musando. Let me also quickly, ask, about this. In many instances in our political sphere, what you have is a political office holder who is going to be there for like maybe 4 years. And meanwhile, your research finding is saying this particular study is going to take like maybe 6, 7, 8 years for them to be able to get fulfilled in a way. So how do we begin to convince those policymakers and say, look, this is a long-term thing. It's not going to be a short time, because in many instances, what they want to do is to get to do something that people will see immediately, that they can say, okay, this is done by so and so and so and so and so. But if you don't have that kind of finding, how do you begin to convince policymakers that this is the right way to go?
Okay, that's a really good question. And I think there are multiple ways you can answer that. So one of the things is something that you referred to yourself, Mr. Sunny, is the idea that change, when we're looking at it, we have to plan for it from the beginning of our research. So yes, it's going to take 8 years, but along those years, we take people along with us. And we don't always look, remember when I was talking about policymakers, I said we need to break that term to look at where do our political actors sit? Where do some of our technocratic actors sit, right? Within ministries or bodies of change, we have much more permanent staff. I'm not sure what it looks like in Nigeria, but I would use an example of Zimbabwe. We'd have a permanent secretary, and those are much more technocrats. They spend much more time within our system. So when we're looking at engaging and sharing evidence, that might actually be the place in which our information at the time is most useful. Might be important to bring those actors along so that they are aware as we're going through that 8 years. And also, we must ask ourselves, where are we framing this question, right? So if in 4 years that person's only got political ambitions and they only want to answer political questions, then is it worth us investing that time to engage? Maybe we need to look at other organizations that have been working in the area for a long time that might take this information and it may be useful to their long-term planning and their long-term aims. So we go back again to asking the question, what is it we're trying to influence, and who are the right people to engage, and at what time do we engage, right? So when we talk about the media, it's really important that we engage when our results are much more solidified, when they're much more, when we're finished, not finished as such, but when our results mean more than engaging when we're still asking some questions, right? Sometimes we then introduce confusion into an issue if we're not careful. But in the beginning of our research, we can actually engage around why it's important to be finding evidence for this issue, what we suspect the environment looks like. And then when we do have the evidence, we go back and say, these are some of the things we found. It's about understanding that landscape and where your evidence actually fits into this landscape.
Oh, thank you very much, Ms. Musando. That was very, very insightful. So this one will go to Mr. Shoyinka. So please, what role do you think social media play when a researcher is trying to engage the public or the policymaker?
Well, I mean, social media is a very powerful tool for reaching certain demographics of people. But what you need to know as a researcher is first determine who are you targeting. I think the last person was talking about, for instance, an ongoing research or a long-term research and something that could happen in the next 5 years or 10 years. So who are you communicating it with now? Who will be useful to in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time? And that determines what kind of media platform you want to use. Even if you go on social media, what kind of platform do you want? Do you want to put this on Twitter? Do you want to put this on Facebook? And what kind of words would you use on each of those platforms? So we all know the group that is referred to as Generation Z. Oldest about 24 years old now. These are people that are projected to be controlling an income range of about $33 trillion by 2030. So are you talking to them right now about your research? And how do you want to reach them? What kind of social media platforms do you think they exist on? They're on Twitter for sure. So how do you want to talk to them on Twitter? What kind of language do you use? So you have to be deliberate about how to couch your communication, who you are targeting with it. And that's why I kept talking about the fact that we like to break it down to something that will be, understandable by a 15-year-old. So if a 15-year-old will understand your research outcome, then you can be sure almost every other person will understand, at least anyone from that age, upper bracket, And that way you're talking to the policymakers of today. You're also talking to the policymakers of tomorrow, because it's important to start engaging them from now. They understand your research. They understand the essence of the research. They understand what impact research or effective research could have on the society. And so when they become policymakers tomorrow, they don't find this strange. You don't have to start from the scratch and explaining to them why it is important that they understand what you're doing and the impact it could have on the society.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shoyinka. That was nice. This will go to Ms. Musani. That's probably, if there are no other questions, this probably will be the last one that we're going to be taking. And this is, somebody here is asking that, in short, what are the effective ways of communicating research?
I seem to get stuck with all the really unfair questions. There's no short answer.
Sorry about that.
No, I think that's a good question. But I think at the heart of what we've both been discussing, Mr. Soyinka and myself, is the need for understanding, what effectiveness means for what purpose, right? So any communication tool can be effective if used well. So something as simple as an email is useful if it has the right audience and is used for the right purpose. So I think, in my experience, the most effective way to communicate your research is really to have a multimedia approach. So looking at your research much more holistically. So not just one size fits all or one tool is enough, but really embody, when we look at how we consume information, we don't just watch TV, we listen to the radio, we go on social media, we talk to people, we read articles. So all those things inform how we consume information. And it's a little bit the same with how we share information. We need to find platforms that we are able to use and for different purposes. So where it might be useful to keep our thoughts written down, we may find a blog is useful, because what it does is create a body of our thinking and unpacks some of the nuance we have in how we're thinking about evidence. Where possible, we might want to do a policy brief or a short policy document. Where necessary, we might want to talk about our research. So I've seen lots of researchers use platforms like Twitter, interestingly, to engage in conversations, to plug in their evidence where it's useful or necessary. We might want to use, so there's a whole variety of ways in which to use media. It really depends on who you're targeting and for what purposes. So the best and the most effective communication is the one where we've thought through what we want that communication to achieve, and we continue to monitor whether these platforms are receiving the results we need them to, and if not, we adjust to ensure that we are.
Thank you very much, Ms. Musandi. Maybe let's quickly take this. I'm afraid this might also go to you. I hope it's not too difficult this time around. Somebody's asking, the challenge in bridging gaps between research and policy actions is that most time, effective communication and dissemination of research findings are not usually considered from the onset, particularly in the areas of funding provisions. Can you please share your opinion with regards to that?
I think that's true, and I think it's a cry for all institutions that support researchers to really think about how we do support them to become effective communicators, right? And part of that is ensuring that we budget for effective research communication. But that being said, I think there were some strategies outlined as well that are not necessarily requiring us to invest a lot of money, but invest in thinking about how to talk about things differently, right? So not everything requires a level of effort in terms of funding, but maybe a little bit about spending some time just distilling what our key messages are, to share them with people in very simple ways, take the time to engage with people around issues in spaces we wouldn't usually do it. So sometimes we tend to just want to talk in academic fora, but maybe there's a conversation happening in civil society where your voice might actually be a useful one to incorporate. So it's about thinking about it in many ways, but I will say that it is important for institutions to think of ways of better supporting researchers to be able to effectively translate their research into consumable products.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mosandu. Thanks a lot. So let me check chat box again. I can't see any more questions here. So based on that, I'm just going to bring this presentation to a close. But first of all, I would like to thank our presenters. Mr. Shoyinka, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time, sharing this information with us. I also thank Ms. Mosandu for giving us this insightful presentation. We really benefited from what you gave us. We appreciate you. Then again, I would also like to, of course, without the GDN, we probably won't be doing this in the first place. So I would like to thank Dr. Daniel Fossey for the support that came from GDN. Thank you very much. Then, of course, our participants, thanks a lot. Without you, we will not be here. Thanks a lot. So, by the way, there will be another series of webinar. So please do join us. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
God bless you.
Bye. Thank you very much. Thanks, Nyasha. Thanks, Mr. Shoyinka. It was very interesting. I learned a lot.
Thank you, Nyasha. Very great to listen to you again today. Thank you, Mr. Shoyinka, for coming around. God be with you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.